88 lovers, 3 strands of pearls, 1 dirty Duchess. Most people look at a 3-strand pearl necklace and see a symbol of unshakable status. I look at mine and see a velvet-lined cage. You see, before the world branded me the dirty Duchess, I was a girl of 15 who believed that love was a sanctuary, only to find it was a slaughterhouse. They say pearls are formed by irritation within the shell, a defense against pain. My life, my public persona, and every smile I ever gave a photographer were exactly that. A lustrous coating over a grain of sand that never stopped cutting me. I was never taught to walk. I was taught to glide. As the only child of George Whigham, a man who turned synthetic silk into an empire of cold hard cash, I was the crown jewel of a commercial dynasty. My childhood was a montage of skyscraper views from our Fifth Avenue penthouse and the hushed, expensive elegance of London's Grosvenor Square. I was a creature of privilege, polished until I shone with a frightening brilliance. In the late 1920s, New York was a fever dream of jazz and gin. I remember the smell of my mother's Chanel No. 5 mingling with the exhaust of Duesenberg's. I was beautiful, not in a soft, approachable way, but with a sharp, symmetrical perfection that felt like an ultimatum. Men didn't just look at me, they stared as if I were a rare exhibit behind bulletproof glass. My father looked at me and saw a merger. My mother looked at me and saw a reflection of her own social ambitions. No one, it seemed, looked at me and saw a girl. By the time we moved back to London, I was the it girl of the century. The British press followed me like a pack of starving hounds. I was the girl who had everything. But wealth has a way of numbing the soul, creating a vacuum that only the most dangerous fire can fill. Then came the summer of 1928. The Isle of Wight was a landscape of chalk cliffs and turquoise waters, but for me, it was the setting of my first true transgression. His name was David Niven. Before he was the dapper star of the silver screen, David was a lean, mischievous cadet from Sandhurst with a moustache that felt like a secret and eyes that promised everything my parents' world forbade. I was 15, he was 18. We met at a regatta, but we truly found each other in the long, honeyed shadows of the island's coastal paths. The heat of that summer was suffocating, matched only by the heat in my own veins. To David, I wasn't the Whigham heiress. I was Margaret, a girl whose laughter he could steal with a single look. We ignored the chaperones, the social codes, and the ticking clock of the season. In the tall grass, hidden from the prying eyes of the yachting set, I surrendered my innocence with a desperate, hungry honesty. It wasn't just a physical act. It was a rebellion. I thought I was choosing my own destiny. I thought I was invincible. I remember the salt on his skin and the way the world seemed to narrow down to the rhythm of our breathing. For a few weeks, I lived in a technicolor dream, unaware that the film was about to snap and melt under the heat of the projector. The dream ended with a nauseating thud. When the morning sickness began, it wasn't just my stomach that turned, it was the entire foundation of my life. I remember standing in the bathroom of our London townhouse, the marble floor cold beneath my feet, realising that the merger my father had planned for me was about to be ruined by a scandal that would echo through every club in St James's. I told my mother. The look in her eyes wasn't concern, it was a calculation of damage. There were no tears, no poor Margaret. There was only the terrifying, efficient machinery of the ultra-rich. My father's reaction was worse. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked through me as if I were a smudge on a window pane. "This will be settled," he said, his voice as dry as parchment, "and you will never speak of that boy again. If you do, you are no daughter of mine." Within 48 hours, I was whisked away to a private nursing home on the outskirts of the city. It was a place of discreet recoveries, a sanitized purgatory where the daughters of the elite went to have their mistakes erased. The silence in that building was deathly. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the countryside, it was the suffocating silence of a secret being buried alive. The procedure was performed in a room that smelled of ether and shame. I remember the ceiling, white, blank, and indifferent. I remember the clink of metal instruments, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. As the anesthesia took hold, I felt a part of myself being torn away. Not just the child, but the girl who believed in the Isle of Wight. When I woke up, I was empty. I was fixed. The nurses treated me with a professional coldness that made me feel like a leper. My father paid the bill, bought the silence of the doctors, and instructed the servants to burn my summer dresses. We never spoke of it again. Not once. The pregnancy was treated as a ghost that had never haunted us, but I could feel the phantom limb of my lost innocence every time I drew a breath. By 1930, the shame had been polished over. I was 19, and it was time for my official debut into society. This was the moment I was born for, the culmination of every etiquette lesson and every dress fitting. The night of Queen Charlotte's ball, I stood before the mirror. My dress was a marvel of white tulle and silver embroidery, a cloud of virginal purity that felt like a mockery of the girl who had bled in a nursing home 2 years prior. My maid fastened the 3-strand pearl necklace around my neck. The weight of the pearls felt like a hand pressing against my throat, a constant, elegant reminder to keep my secrets locked away. "You look like an angel, Miss Whigham," the maid whispered. I looked at my reflection and didn't recognise the person staring back. I saw a masterpiece of artifice. I saw a woman who had learned that the world only loves you if you are flawless, and that truth is a liability. When I entered the ballroom at Grosvenor House, the air seemed to leave the room. The flashbulbs of the press photographers exploded like miniature suns. "The most beautiful debutante in decades," they whispered. I walked down the grand staircase, each step a triumph of will over memory. I saw my father standing at the edge of the floor, nodding with a grim satisfaction. I had been restored. I was a high-value asset once more. I danced. I laughed. I flirted with counts and captains. I was crowned debutante of the year, the undisputed queen of the London season. My face was on every magazine cover, the epitome of grace and breeding. But as the orchestra played and the champagne flowed, I felt a chilling detachment. I realised that the Veblen good that was Margaret Whigham was a shell. Inside, there was a vast, echoing hollow. The scar from 1928 hadn't healed. It had simply been covered by the finest pearls money could buy. I looked at the glittering crowd, the dukes, the dowagers, the judgmental elite, and I felt a flicker of icy disdain. "You think you know me," I thought as I flashed a perfect, practiced smile for the cameras. "You think I am one of you. But I have seen the darkness behind your velvet curtains. I have paid for your morality with my own blood. And from this day forward, I will never let anyone get close enough to see the stitches." Velocity is a strange narcotic. It tricks you into believing you can outrun your own ghost. In the years following my debut, I didn't just want to be loved. I wanted to be consumed by a speed so intense that the silence of that nursing home could no longer catch me. I traded the slow, suffocating drawing rooms of London for the roar of airplane engines and the predatory gaze of men who lived as if tomorrow were an urban myth. But the problem with flying high is that the air eventually runs thin, and the fall, when it comes, is always silent. By 1931, I was the sun around which the European social galaxy revolved. I was no longer the fragile girl from the Isle of Wight. I was Margaret Whigham, a woman whose image was etched into the retinas of every eligible bachelor, from Mayfair to the Riviera. I moved through the world with a calculated magnetism, drawing in men who were as powerful as they were dangerous. Among them was Prince Ali Khan. He was a man who breathed charisma like oxygen. To Ali, women were like his thoroughbred horses, prized for their lineage, their grace, and the thrill of the chase. Our flirtation was a dance of high-stakes vanity. He showered me with orchids and whispered promises of eastern palaces, but even then I could see the fleeting nature of his devotion. He was a collector of moments, and I was the rarest coin in the room. But Ali was merely a distraction, a glittering ornament in my peripheral vision. My heart, or what was left of it, had been captured by a man made of steel and adrenaline, Commander Glenn Kidston. Glenn was not like the soft, pampered lords of the London clubs. He was a record-breaking aviator, a racing driver, and a survivor of submarine disasters. He had eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning a distant horizon, looking for the next boundary to break. To the world, he was the richest and luckiest man in England. To me, he was the only person who matched my own inner restlessness. When I was with Glenn, the world felt electric. We didn't just attend parties, we invaded them. He would pick me up in his roaring sports cars, the wind tearing at my silk scarves, and for the first time since David, I felt a pulse that wasn't dictated by my father's metronome. Glenn lived with a magnificent disregard for mortality. He had survived a crash in a Junkers aircraft where everyone else had perished, and he carried that survival like a badge of invincibility. I remember one afternoon in early 1931, sitting in the cockpit of a plane with him. The scent of leather and aviation fuel was more intoxicating than any perfume. He looked at me, his hand over mine on the controls, and for a second, the 3-strand pearl necklace at my throat felt light, as if gravity itself had been suspended. "The sky doesn't care about your secrets, Margaret," he told me, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engine. "Up here, you're just a speck of light." I loved him for that. I loved him because he didn't want to possess my past. He wanted to share a future that was lived at 200 miles per hour. We were the golden couple, the icons of a new, faster age. I began to believe that perhaps the scars of my youth could be cauterized by the sheer friction of our life together. The end came on the 5th of May, 1931. Glenn was in South Africa, attempting to break the flight record from London to Cape Town. I was in London, preparing for another season of mindless glamour, waiting for the telegram that would tell me he had landed triumphant once again. I was at a dinner party when the news arrived. It didn't come as a telegram, it came as a hush that moved across the room like a cold front. Glenn's puss moth aircraft had broken up in mid-air during a dust storm over the Drakensberg Mountains. He hadn't just crashed, the sky had literally torn his wings off. There were no survivors. The luckiest man in the world had run out of time. I remember the feeling of the air being sucked out of the room. My hand flew to my neck, my fingers gripping my 3-strand pearls so hard the silk thread nearly snapped. I didn't cry. Not then. The Whigham training was too deep for that. I simply stood there, a frozen statue of a debutante, while the world turned into a grey, featureless blur. Glenn was gone, and with him, the only version of a future that didn't feel like a funeral procession. The silence I had fled from in the nursing home had returned, and this time it was louder than any engine. Grief, for a woman in my position, is not allowed to be messy. It must be decorative. My mother saw my devastation not as a loss of love, but as a loss of momentum. "You must keep moving, Margaret," she warned. "A woman who stands still is a woman who is forgotten." I followed her advice with a vengeance. I entered a period of frantic, hollow engagements. I was a ghost, trying to find a body to inhabit. First, there was Charles Greville, the 7th Earl of Warwick. He was handsome, titled, and utterly boring. He offered stability, a throne in the aristocracy, and a life of predictable luxury. We announced our engagement, and the press went wild. But every time he kissed me, I tasted the stale air of a museum. I broke it off just weeks before the wedding, leaving the society columns in a frenzy. Then came Max Aitken, the son of Lord Beaverbrook. Max was wealthy and powerful, part of the media elite that would eventually become my executioner. We were engaged for a fleeting, frantic moment. I was trying to fill the crater Glenn had left in my soul with titles and bank accounts, but nothing fit. I was throwing diamonds into a bottomless well. I was reckless. I was the Great Whigham, a woman who collected fiancés like charms on a bracelet. People started to whisper. They called me fickle. They didn't understand that I wasn't looking for a husband. I was looking for an anchor. I was terrified that if I weren't attached to someone, I would simply float away and vanish into the cold South African sky where Glenn had died. In the midst of this chaos, I met Charles Sweeney. He was an American golfer, a wealthy businessman, and a man who possessed a sturdy, uncomplicated masculinity that I mistook for safety. He wasn't a prince like Ali, and he wasn't a daredevil like Glenn. He was a pillar. He looked at me with an adoration that was both comforting and smothering. Charles didn't care about my it-girl status. He wanted a wife who would be the centerpiece of his mahogany-panelled life. And in my exhaustion, in my grief-stricken panic, I convinced myself that this was what I wanted too. I wanted to stop flying. I wanted to stop the velocity. When he proposed, I said yes with a sense of grim relief. The papers hailed it as the wedding of the century. I was to be a Sweeney. I would leave the Whigham name behind, along with the girl who fell in love with David Niven and the woman who broke her heart over Glenn Kidston. As the wedding date approached in 1933, I sat in front of my vanity, staring at my reflection. I put on the 3-strand pearl necklace, the light catching the iridescent surface of the gems. They looked perfect. They looked unbreakable. "This is the end of the search," I whispered to the glass. I didn't know that the real horror was only just beginning. I didn't know that the safety of marriage would become a cage far more brutal than any I had ever known. I was about to trade the sky for a nursery that would remain perpetually silent. The world saw the wedding of the century, the 20-foot train of Norman Hartnell lace, the thousands of onlookers blocking the streets of Knightsbridge, the flashbulbs that turned noon into a blinding white eternity. They saw a bride who was the envy of every woman in the empire. But as I stood at the altar, my hand trembling against my bouquet, I wasn't thinking of a life of glamour. I was thinking of a legacy. I was a Whigham. I was meant to produce heirs as flawlessly as my father produced silk. I didn't know then that my womb would become a graveyard, and that the only thing I would successfully give birth to was a madness born of grief. Marriage to Charles Sweeney was supposed to be my anchorage. He was a man of solid lines and predictable desires. He wanted a home that functioned like a Swiss watch, a social calendar that commanded respect, and, above all, a son to carry the Sweeney name into the next American century. In the beginning, I tried. Oh, how I tried to be the woman the magazines described. I played the role of the devoted wife in our house at Upper Brook Street, surrounded by Louis XV furniture and the heavy, expensive scent of lilies. But the house felt less like a home and more like a stage set, and the most important room on that set, the nursery, remained a hollow, echoing chamber. I had been raised to believe that beauty and wealth could negotiate with destiny. I thought that if I wore the right clothes and spoke in the perfect register, life would provide the standard rewards. I was wrong. My body, so praised for its outward symmetry, was failing a secret internal test. The year was 1933. This was the one that was supposed to survive. I had already endured 3 miscarriages by then, quick, sharp bursts of pain followed by a day or 2 of bed rest and the polite, averted eyes of my doctors. But this pregnancy felt different. I had reached the 8th month. My belly was heavy, a physical weight that finally made me feel anchored to the earth. I had picked out the lace for the christening gown. I had felt the flutter of life, a small, rhythmic tapping that felt like a secret code between me and the future. Then, the tapping stopped. It wasn't a sudden agony. It was a gradual, terrifying cooling. I woke up one morning and realized the weight inside me had changed. It was no longer a life. It was an anchor of lead. I waited. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to since the nursing home in 1928. I walked the halls of Upper Brook Street, my hand instinctively clutching my 3-strand pearl necklace, the cold gems pressing into my skin as if trying to jumpstart my own heart. When the doctor finally arrived, the silence in the room was louder than any scream. He didn't need to say the words. I saw it in the way he tucked his stethoscope away. The child, a girl, was dead. The labour that followed was a descent into a private hell. For hours, I struggled to bring forth a shadow. There is no pain quite like the labour of a stillbirth. It is an effort without a reward, a violent exertion to meet a tragedy. When she finally arrived, the room remained silent. No cry, no breath. Just the soft, wet sound of a life that had decided the world was too cruel to enter. I insisted on seeing her. They told me I shouldn't, that it would upset me. I screamed until they relented. She was perfect. She had my nose and Charles's chin. She looked like a porcelain doll waiting for a clockmaker to wind her up. I held her for a moment, a cold, fleeting eternity, before they took her away to a nameless grave. If the stillbirth was the earthquake, the years that followed were the aftershocks that levelled my soul. 1, 2, 3. Eventually, 8. 8 times I felt the spark of hope, and 8 times I watched it wash away in a blur of blood and white hospital sheets. The press continued to print photos of me at the races, at the opera, smiling brilliantly with my 3-strand pearls gleaming under the chandeliers. They wrote about my effortless elegance, They didn't see me in the bathroom at 3 a.m., clutching the sink, watching my future go down the drain. They didn't see the way Charles began to look at me, not with love, but with a growing, silent resentment. To him, I was a malfunctioning machine, a beautiful, expensive toy that couldn't perform its primary function. The psychological exhaustion was absolute. Each loss took a piece of my sanity with it. I began to feel disconnected from my own body. If my body could not create life, then what was it for? It became an instrument of decoration, a vessel for pleasure that led nowhere. I started to loathe the purity expected of a wife. There was a growing fire of bitterness in me, a feeling that if I was to be denied the sanctity of motherhood, I would find my own ways to feel alive. Charles retreated into his work and his golf, leaving me alone in a house that felt like a mausoleum for children who never breathed. We were two ghosts haunting a mansion. I remember sitting in the nursery one evening. I had never allowed the servants to clear out the cradle or the unused toys. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I began to twist my 3-strand pearl necklace, winding it tighter and tighter around my fingers until the skin turned white. I realized then that I was changing. The debutante of the year was gone. The grieving mother was dying. In their place, a new Margaret was forming, one who was cynical, hungry, and dangerously untethered. I felt a desperate need to be touched, to be validated, to prove that my body was still a site of power, even if it was a site of death. I began to look at other men, not for love, for I no longer believed in that fairy tale, but for the temporary spark of being wanted. I needed to drown out the silence of the nursery with the noise of the world. My marriage to Charles was becoming a hollow shell, much like my pearls. Beautiful on the outside, but built around a core of irritation and pain. I was a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown that the world would mistake for a social whirlwind. If I cannot be a mother, I whispered to the empty cradle, then I will be a legend. And legends don't need to be good. They say your life flashes before your eyes when you fall. But mine didn't. Instead, the world simply dissolved into a terrifying, howling vacuum. One moment, I was a lady of high society stepping out for a fitting on Bond Street. The next, I was a broken bird plummeting through the gut of a building. I fell 40 feet, but I landed in a different reality altogether. When they sewed my scalp back together, they didn't just mend the skin, they rewired the woman inside. The Margaret who went down that shaft was a grieving wife. The Margaret who climbed out was a stranger, even to herself. London in 1943 was a city of grit and shadows, scarred by the Blitz but still clinging to the rituals of the upper class. War or no war, a woman of my standing had appearances to maintain. I was visiting my chiropodist on Bond Street, moving with the practiced grace that had become my second nature. I remember the day was unusually grey, the air thick with the smell of coal, smoke and damp pavement. I reached for the elevator door, an old-fashioned, heavy iron gate. In my mind, I was already at my next appointment, calculating my social manoeuvres. The door opened. I didn't look. I trusted the world to be where I expected it to be. I stepped forward into what I thought was the carpeted safety of the lift car. There was nothing. The sensation of falling is not a sudden shock. It is a sickening realization of weightlessness, followed by the roar of the wind. I didn't scream at first. The air was sucked out of my lungs as gravity claimed me. I fell 40 feet, 4 stories of sheer, terrifying acceleration. In a desperate, primal reflex, my hands lashed out, searching for anything to stop the descent. My fingers found the greasy steel elevator cables. The friction was instantaneous and brutal. I felt the skin of my palms tear away as I slid, the cables biting into my flesh like serrated knives. My fingernails snapped, my blood spraying against the dark walls of the shaft as I tried to claw my way back to the light. Then, the impact. It was a sound more felt than heard, a dull, bone-shattering thud as I hit the top of the elevator car at the bottom of the pit. Darkness didn't come immediately. There was a moment of crystalline agony, a white-hot flare of pain that originated in my skull and radiated down to my very marrow. My head had struck the ironwork. I lay there, crumpled like a discarded silk rag, the smell of grease and my own copper-scented blood filling my nostrils. My three-strand pearl necklace had survived the fall, but the clasp had dug into my neck, the pearls stained with the red spray from my hands. I remember looking at one pearl that had rolled near my eye. It looked like a tiny, pale moon in a sky of soot. Then, finally, the mercy of the void took me. I woke up in a world of white pain. I was at St. George's Hospital, my head swathed in heavy bandages that felt like a leaden crown. The doctors spoke in hushed, grave tones. They told me I was a miracle. A few inches to the left, and my neck would have snapped. A few pounds more of force, and my skull would have shattered beyond repair. As it was, they spent hours debriding the wounds on my hands and sewing my scalp back together. 33 stitches. I could feel each one, a tiny, tugging reminder that I was still anchored to my body. But as the days passed and the physical pain began to dull under the haze of morphine, something else began to stir. It started as a restlessness in my blood, a hum beneath the skin that I couldn't explain. I looked at the doctors, the orderlies, even the strangers passing my door, and felt a sudden, predatory surge of interest. It was as if the fall had cracked open a vault inside me. The Margaret who had been suppressed by the nursery of ghosts, the Margaret who had been moulded by Whigham decorum, had been discarded in that elevator pit. In her place was something primal. When I finally returned home to Charles, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and horror. My hands were scarred, and my hair had to be kept short to hide the jagged line of the stitches. But he didn't see the real change. He didn't see that the woman he married had died on Bond Street. The doctors today might call it frontal lobe syndrome, a personality change caused by brain trauma. The courts would later use a much uglier word, nymphomania. But to me it felt like a liberation. The moral compass that had guided my life, the one that told me to be a good wife, a discreet socialite, had been smashed. I felt a voracious, uncontrollable hunger for life, for sensation, for the heat of another person's skin. It wasn't about love anymore. Love was a lie that led to empty cradles and dead aviators. This was about power. This was about proving that I was alive every second of every day. I began to seek out lovers with a frantic, systematic intensity. I didn't care about their status or their names. I cared about the moment of surrender. I would sit at dinner parties, the three-strand pearl necklace gleaming under the candles, and I would look at the man sitting across from me, perhaps a cabinet minister, perhaps a young officer, and I would decide then and there that I would have him. There was no guilt. The fall had stripped away my capacity for shame. I felt as if I were living on borrowed time, and I intended to spend every second of it in the pursuit of the only thing that made the silence go away, the friction of desire. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake up feeling the sensation of falling. I would reach for my throat, making sure the pearls were still there, the only constant in a world that had become a kaleidoscope of faces and bodies. Charles noticed, of course. He noticed the phone calls, the late nights, the strange energy that made me seem almost radioactive. Our marriage, already frayed by the losses of our children, began to disintegrate in the heat of my new persona. He wanted a convalescent. He got a Maynard. I would stand on the balcony of our home and look out at the London skyline, the searchlights of the anti-aircraft guns crisscrossing the stars. I felt a strange kinship with the city, broken, bombed, yet refusing to die. "I am not the woman you married," I told Charles once, though I knew he wasn't really listening. "That woman is still at the bottom of the shaft on Bond Street. You're living with the ghost who climbed out." I was no longer Margaret Sweeney, the tragic heiress. I was something else, something dangerous. And the world, with all its hypocritical rules, was about to find out exactly how much damage a woman with 33 stitches and a three-strand pearl necklace could do. Every woman, no matter how cynical she claims to be, harbours a secret desire to be the one who tames the beast. I had survived a 40-foot fall and 8 lost children. Yet I was still foolish enough to believe that a title and a castle could provide the sanctuary I craved. When I met Ian Campbell, I thought I had found a dark prince from a Gothic novel. I didn't realise that the castle was a ruin, the prince was a predator, and the happily ever after was a transaction written in my own blood. I went to him seeking a soulmate. He came to me seeking a checkbook. The war had ended, and my marriage to Charles Sweeney had finally dissolved into the ashes of neglect and my own restless infidelity. I was a free woman, wealthy, beautiful, and more dangerous than ever. It was 1947 on a train headed to Paris that I first encountered Ian Douglas Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll. He was the very image of the Scottish aristocracy, rugged, brooding, and possessed of a quiet, lethal charm. He had spent years as a prisoner of war in Germany, a fact that gave him an air of tragic mystery that I found irresistible. He looked like a man who had seen the abyss and survived. With his piercing gaze and the effortless authority of his lineage, he was the Byronic hero I hadn't known I was looking for. I remember him leaning against the doorway of the carriage, the smoke from his cigarette curling around his head like a crown of thorns. "You're Margaret Sweeney," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "The woman who fell from the sky." I laughed, my hand instinctively going to my 3-strand pearl necklace. "I didn't fall from the sky, Ian. I fell into a hole." "There's a difference." "Not to me," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "In Scotland, we appreciate things that have been through the fire." He wooed me with a calculated intensity. He spoke of Inverary Castle, the ancestral seat of the Clan Campbell, a place of mists and legends on the shores of Loch Fyne. He made me feel that my life of London parties was trivial, and that my true destiny was to be a duchess, the chatelaine of a historic empire. I was blinded by the romance of it all. I thought that by becoming Her Grace, the Duchess of Argyll, I could finally bury the dirty Margaret the gossips whispered about. It didn't take long for the romantic fog to lift, revealing the jagged rocks beneath. Even before we were married in 1951, I began to see the cracks in the Duke's armour. Ian was not a hero, he was a hollow man. The mystery I had seen in his eyes was often nothing more than the dull glaze of alcohol. He drank with a desperate, joyless persistence, starting with gin in the morning and ending with whiskey late into the night. But it wasn't just the drink. He was a man of the modern age in the worst way, dependent on Purple Hearts, amphetamines to stay awake, and barbiturates to sleep. His moods swung like a pendulum between terrifying rages and a cold, death-like apathy. I would find him in the library of his London house, staring at nothing, his hands shaking. When I tried to comfort him, he would recoil as if my touch were acid. "You don't understand, Margaret," he would snarl, his breath smelling of stale spirits. "You're just a Whigham. You have money, but you have no history. I carry the weight of centuries." It was a classic aristocratic trap. He looked down on the trade that had made my father rich, yet he couldn't survive a single day without the luxuries that trade provided. He was a gambler who had lost his shirt at the tables of Mayfair, and he viewed me as his final, winning hand. When I finally arrived in Inverary Castle as the new Duchess, my heart sank. The magnificent seat he had described was a decaying corpse. The roof leaked, the walls were weeping with damp, and the legendary tapestries were being eaten by moths. The castle was freezing, a cavernous stone mouth that swallowed heat and light, and then came the realization of why I was truly there. "The roof will cost £60,000, Ian said one morning, over a breakfast of cold toast and tension. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ceiling, and the drainage in the east wing is non-existent. My father left me a title, Margaret, but he left me no way to polish it. I became the Bank of Whigham. I poured my inheritance into that pile of stones. I paid for the plumbers, the electricians, the roofers, and the decorators. I spent thousands upon thousands of pounds to restore the lustre to the Campbell name. I thought that by saving his home, I could save him. I thought that if I made the castle beautiful again, he would look at me with the love he reserved for his ancestors. I was wrong. The more I gave, the more he hated me for it. My wealth was a constant reminder of his own failure. He treated me like an intrusive tenant in his family's history. Life at Inverary was a study in psychological warfare. Ian would disappear for days into the Highlands to hunt, only to return smelling of cheap perfume and expensive scotch. He was flagrantly unfaithful, yet he watched me with a paranoid, hawk-like intensity. He knew my history. He knew about the elevator fall and the new Margaret, and he used that knowledge like a whip. "You're a nymphomaniac, Margaret," he would whisper in the dark, his voice dripping with contempt. "Everyone knows it. You think those pearls make you a lady? They just make you a target." I would lie awake in the cold, cavernous master bedroom, listening to the wind howl off the loch. I would touch my 3-strand pearl necklace, the only thing in that castle that truly belonged to me. The pearls felt like a cold chain. I had traded my freedom for a title that felt like a shroud. I began to realise that Ian hadn't married me for companionship or even for my beauty. He had married me to strip mine my life. He wanted my money to fix his castle, and he wanted my reputation as a shield for his own debauchery. He was the devil of the Highlands, and I was the sacrificial lamb who had walked into his altar of her own free will. The emptiness I felt was different from the grief of my lost children. This was a hollow, echoing despair. I had sought a harbour and found a shipwreck. But even as the walls of Inverare closed in on me, the fire that had been sparked by the fall on Bond Street didn't go out. It began to turn into a cold, vengeful flame. If Ian wanted a war, I would give him one. If he wanted to call me a monster, I would show him what a monster with a millionaire's bank account could do. I sat at my vanity, staring at the reflection of the Duchess of Argyll. I looked perfect. I looked regal. But behind the pearls, I was already planning my escape, unaware that the Duke had already set his own trap, one that involved a locksmith, a private investigator, and a small, square camera that would change the course of my life forever. Desperation is a quiet, hungry thing. It doesn't scream, it whispers in the middle of the night, suggesting the impossible until the impossible starts to look like the only way out. By 1954, I was no longer a wife or a muse. I was an insurgent in my own home. Ian had turned Inverare into a fortress of contempt, and I realised that in the eyes of the Campbell clan, I was merely a temporary tenant, a golden goose to be plucked and then discarded. To survive, I decided I needed a weapon. I decided I needed a son. And if nature would not give me one, I would steal one from the gods themselves. The atmosphere within the stone walls of the castle had turned glacial. Ian and I were no longer speaking in anything but sharp, jagged fragments of sentences. He had taken my money, reinforced his roof, and stabilised his estates, and in return he treated me with the indifference one might show to a piece of furniture that had outlived its fashion. I was an outsider. The staff, loyal to the Campbell bloodline for generations, looked at me with suspicious, hooded eyes. I would walk down the long, drafty corridors, the clicking of my heels echoing like gunfire, and feel the weight of 1,000 ancestors judging me from their oil-painted frames. I was the American's daughter, the synthetic silk heiress, the woman who thought she could buy her way into 1,000 years of history. But the sharpest thorn in my side was Ian's heir from his previous marriage, Ian Younger Campbell. As long as he stood as the next in line, I was expendable. If Ian died, I would be cast out of Inverare with nothing but my jewellery and my scars. The thought of being humiliated once more, of being settled and sent away as I was in 1928, ignited a frantic, irrational fire in my mind. The new Margaret, the one born from the elevator shaft, did not know how to surrender. She only knew how to escalate. I began a campaign of subtle, poisonous subversion. I had access to Ian's stationery, his seals, and his world. In the quiet of my morning room, with the mists of Loch Fyne swirling outside the window, I began to draft letters. I forged correspondence that suggested Ian's children were not his own, or that they were plotting against him. I used my wit to mimic the cadences of his enemies, planting seeds of doubt in his already paranoid, drug-addled mind. I remember sitting at my desk, my 3-strand pearl necklace clicking against the wood as I leaned forward to perfect a signature. Each letter was a brick in a wall I was building to isolate Ian from his own blood. It was madness, I see that now. But at the time, it felt like a holy war. I was fighting for my place at the table. I was fighting to ensure that the Duke of Argyll would have to look at me, and only me, as his lifeline. But the letters weren't enough. Ian was chaotic, but he wasn't entirely a fool. He burned with a slow, resentful suspicion. He began to track my movements, hiring private detectives to follow me through the streets of London. The hunter was being hunted, and the air in the castle grew so thick with malice that it felt like breathing ash. Then came the most desperate plan of all. It was born of the hollow ache that had never truly left me since 1933, the year of the silent nursery. I was 41 years old. The 8 lost pregnancies had left my body a map of disappointment. Yet, the obsession with an heir consumed me. I convinced myself that if I could present Ian with a son, the miracle of a new Campbell line would bind him to me forever. He would have to love me. The world would have to respect me. I began to look into acquiring a child. Through a series of murky connections in London and abroad, I sought out a baby who could pass as a Campbell. I focused my search on a Polish baby, a boy whose features might blend with the dark, brooding look of the Scottish aristocracy. I went as far as to simulate the symptoms of pregnancy again. I wore looser clothes. I spoke of morning sickness with a practiced, weary joy. I wanted to believe my own lie so badly that I started to feel the phantom weight in my womb. I visited secret locations in the East End, meeting with middlemen who dealt in the shadows of the post-war adoption black market. I remember standing in a dim, drafty flat in London, looking at a small, sleeping infant. For a moment, the old Margaret, the girl who held her stillborn daughter in 1933, surfaced. My heart broke for the child, but the Duchess of Argyll quickly pushed her back down. This child is a pawn, I told myself. He is the key to the castle. I had the money. I had the plan. I would go away to a clinic in Switzerland and return with a miraculous late-born heir. I was ready to buy a human soul to secure a title. The scheme failed not because of a change of heart, but because of the sheer, terrifying scale of the logistics and Ian's growing vigilance. He wasn't just a drunk. He was a predator who recognized another predator's scent. He began to mock my pregnancy. "You're getting thick in the waist, Margaret," he said one evening, circling me like a shark. "But we both know there's nothing in there but bitterness and Whigham money." The psychological toll was devastating. I was living a dozen lives at once. The dutiful Duchess, the grieving mother, the forged letter writer, the buyer of babies. I was spinning faster and faster, and the centrifugal force was tearing my sanity apart. I started to sleep less. I relied on the same Purple Hearts Ian used just to keep my nerves from shattering. I would stand in front of the mirrors at Inverare, clutching my 3-strand pearl necklace, twisting it until the skin of my neck was raw and red. The pearls were the only thing that felt real. They were cold, hard, and expensive, just like the life I had built. "Why won't you just die?" I whispered to Ian's portrait in the Great Hall. "Why won't you let me be the woman I was supposed to be?" The war in the shadows had reached a stalemate. I had failed to tarnish his heirs, and I had failed to manufacture my own. I was trapped in a marriage that had become a mutually assured destruction. I didn't know that while I was plotting to steal a child, Ian was plotting to steal my soul. He was waiting for me to leave for New York. He was waiting for the moment when I would lower my guard so he could strike at the one thing I had left: my privacy. Privacy is a luxury the poor cannot afford, and the rich cannot protect. I had spent decades building a fortress of etiquette, a high-walled garden of Her Grace and the Duchess, only to realise that the man sharing my bed was actually a sapper tunnelling beneath my feet. While I was in New York breathing the free air of Manhattan, Ian was in London with a locksmith and a heart of ice. He didn't just break into my cupboard, he broke into my skin. And there, in the flickering light of his betrayal, he found the one thing I could never polish away: the evidence of my own hunger. In the winter of 1958, I went to New York. I told myself it was for a change of air, for the shopping, for the relief of being away from the damp, judgmental stones of Inverare. In reality, I was fleeing the ghost of the woman I had become in Scotland. New York was a city that didn't care about the Campbells. It only cared about the present. I stayed at the Sherry Netherland, surrounding myself with people who laughed loudly and drank because they were happy, not because they were drowning. For a few weeks, I felt the lightness of my youth again. I walked down Fifth Avenue, my 3-strand pearl necklace tucked under a heavy mink coat, feeling like the girl who hadn't yet fallen down an elevator shaft. But thousands of miles away, the Byronic devil was at work. Ian wasn't drinking away his sorrows in my absence, he was hunting. He knew I had secrets. He knew that the restlessness in my blood, the legacy of the 33 stitches, meant I lived lives he couldn't see. He didn't want the truth to save our marriage. He wanted the truth to incinerate me so he could walk away with the ashes of my fortune. While I was dining at Le Pavillon, Ian was standing in our London house at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street. He had hired a locksmith to do what a husband should never do, violate the sanctuary of a wife's private correspondence. I can almost see it now, like a scene from a noir film. The clicking of the picks against the brass tumblers of my private desk. The heavy breathing of a man who had traded his honour for a chance at a lucrative divorce. The drawer didn't just hold letters. It held my essence. He didn't find the Polish baby. That scheme had already dissolved into the mists. Instead, he found a collection of Polaroids. They were images taken in the heat of the moment, snapshots of a woman who had long ago decided that her body was her own to give or sell. In those photos, I was not the Duchess of Argyll. I was a creature of pure, unadulterated desire. In the most famous of them, the one that would eventually haunt the dreams of every voyeur in England, I was naked, save for my 3-strand pearl necklace. The contrast was lethal. The ultimate symbol of aristocratic purity draped over the skin of a woman engaged in an act the 1950s considered unpardonable. To Ian, those photos weren't a heartbreak. They were a jackpot. He didn't see a lonely woman seeking validation. He saw a dirty duchess he could use to blackmail the world into pitying him. The violation didn't stop at the desk. I returned to London to find a house that felt altered. There was a lingering coldness in the air, a sense that the walls had grown ears. Ian was different too. He was no longer raging. He was smug. He watched me with a terrifying, quiet amusement. One afternoon, as I was being driven to a luncheon, I noticed a strange smudge of grease near the floorboards of the car. Later, through a slip of a servant's tongue and my own growing paranoia, I discovered the truth. Ian had bugged my car. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every conversation I'd had with my friends, every whisper of frustration, every flirtatious word spoken in the backseat of that Rolls-Royce had been recorded, transcribed, and filed away by Ian's legal team. I felt a sudden, violent nausea. It wasn't just that I was being watched. It was the feeling of being owned. I sat in my bedroom, my hands trembling as I reached for my 3-strand pearls. I pulled them so tight I could hear the silk thread groan. I felt naked, even though I was fully dressed. I realised that for years, while I was pouring my millions into his roof and his plumbing, he had been spending his time and my money to build a cage for me. "You've been busy, Ian," I whispered to the empty room. "You've turned our life into a police state." The betrayal was total. It was a surgical strike against my identity. In the world I was raised in, you could do almost anything, as long as you kept the curtains drawn. Ian hadn't just opened the curtains, he had invited the entire world into my bedroom to watch me bleed. I remember the night I found out he had the photos. I didn't cry. The Whigham in me wouldn't allow it. I stood before the long mirror in my dressing room, the same mirror where I had practiced my debutante of the year smile decades ago. I looked at the pearls. They were the vessel of my identity. Yet they were now the very thing that identified me in those obscene pictures. I realised then that the pearls were no longer jewellery. They were a brand. They were the evidence. The fear was a cold, sharp blade in my gut, but beneath it, the old defiance began to stir. Ian thought he had won. He thought that by exposing my nymphomania, he would break me. He didn't understand that I had already survived the death of my children, the death of my lovers, and a 40-foot fall. "You want a scandal, Ian?" I said to his phantom in the mirror, my voice steady and cold. "I will give you a scandal that will make the history of the Campbells look like a nursery rhyme. You want the dirty Duchess? Then you'd better be prepared for the mud she's going to throw back." But as I turned off the light, the silence of the house felt predatory. The Polaroid ghost was out of the drawer, and it was walking the streets of London, waiting for the sun to rise on the most sensational trial of the century. I was a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, and this time, there was no elevator cable to catch me. There is no arena more savage than a British courtroom when a woman's reputation is on the menu. In 1963, the world didn't want justice. They wanted a sacrificial lamb wrapped in silk. Ian stood there, the grieving, cuckolded duke. while his lawyers unfurled a list of 88 men like a scroll of my sins. They took my private joys, my desperate hungers, and my very identity, and they dragged them through the London mud until I was no longer Margaret Campbell. I was merely the dirty Duchess, a headline designed to sell papers and soothe the consciences of 1,000 hypocrites. The courtroom in Edinburgh was a place of dark wood, stale air, and a heavy, suffocating sense of Victorian morality. As I walked to my seat, the silence was so thick it felt like physical resistance. I could feel the heat of 100 eyes on my back, journalists, socialites who had once begged for invitations to my parties, and the morbidly curious who had queued in the rain just to catch a glimpse of my fall. I wore a suit of impeccable tailoring and, of course, my 3-strand pearl necklace. It was my armour. It was the only thing that felt solid in a world that was dissolving into a sea of ink and bile. I sat with my back straight, a statue of defiance, while Ian's counsel began to methodically dismantle my life. The accusation was staggering. 88 men. They claimed I had turned the ducal bed into a revolving door for cabinet ministers, actors, and 3 quarterbacks. They produced my diaries, my private, scrawled thoughts, and read them aloud with a clinical, mocking tone that made my skin crawl. Every flirtation was a crime, every moment of human connection was gross obscenity. I was not a woman to be slaughtered without a fight. I knew Ian's secrets, the darkness that lived behind his title. I launched my own counter-offensive, a move that sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. I accused Ian of adultery with my own stepmother, Jane Whigham. I remember the gasps in the room when the allegation was read. It was the ultimate taboo. I had seen the way they looked at each other, the coded language of their betrayals, the way my father's wealth and my husband's lust had formed a sickening alliance against me. I knew the truth of it in my marrow, but truth in a courtroom is only as strong as your witnesses. And who would stand for me? The servants were Ian's, the friends were terrified of the Duke's reach. I stood alone. My accusations were dismissed as the delusions of a desperate woman, a frantic attempt to deflect from my own debauchery. I watched Ian across the aisle. He didn't look like a man accused of incestuous betrayal. He looked like a man who had already won. He had the Polaroids. He had the state. He had the judge. Then came the moment that defined my life in the eyes of history. The headless man photos were produced. The judge, Lord Wheatley, leaned forward, his face a mask of moral revulsion as he examined the snapshots Ian had stolen from my drawer. In the flickering light of the court's scrutiny, there I was, the Duchess, the heiress, the it-girl, captured in a moment of raw intimacy. The man in the photo was anonymous, his head cropped out of the frame, but I was unmistakable. My face was clear, and draped around my neck, glowing with a ghostly, iridescent light, was the 3-strand pearl necklace. It was the ultimate betrayal of my own signature. The jewellery that was meant to signify my status had become the definitive mark of my shame. The court didn't see a woman who had been traumatised by loss, who had fallen 40 feet into a psychological abyss, or who was seeking the touch of a human being in a cold, dead marriage. They saw a nymphomaniac. They saw a woman who had dared to enjoy her own body without the permission of a man. When the time came for the verdict, Lord Wheatley didn't just rule, he executed. His judgment lasted over 3 hours, a marathon of vitriol that would remain one of the longest in British legal history. Her attitude to the sanctity of marriage was what modernists might call enlightened, but what any right-thinking person would call wholly immoral, he thundered, his voice echoing in the rafters. He called me a woman of easy virtue, a highly sexed woman who had ceased to be satisfied with normal relations. He used words like perverted and disgusting, but the word that cut the deepest, the one that the newspapers screamed from every street corner, was the dirty Duchess. I sat there, my hand gripping my pearls so hard my knuckles were white as bone. I felt a strange, cold detachment. It was as if I were watching a play about someone else. Is this it? I thought. Is this the sum of a life? To be reduced to a judge's adjective? Ian was granted his divorce. He kept the castle I had fixed. He kept the reputation I had helped him polish with my money. I was cast out, stripped of my title in all but name, and branded with a scarlet letter that no amount of Whigham gold could ever wash away. As I left the court, the mob was waiting. The flashbulbs were a blinding, stuttering white light, a hellish version of my debutante ball. People hissed at me. They called out insults. I didn't bow my head. I didn't cover my face with a veil. I walked to my car, my heels clicking on the pavement with a steady, rhythmic defiance. I adjusted my 3-strand pearl necklace, ensuring it was perfectly centered. If I were to be the Dirty Duchess, I would be the most elegant one they had ever seen. I looked through the window of the car as we pulled away, seeing my own reflection in the glass. I looked old. I looked tired. But I also looked free. The secret was out. The cage was broken. I had lost my fortune, my standing, and my honour. But Ian had failed to do the one thing he truly wanted. He hadn't made me apologise. "They want me to hide," I whispered to the empty seat beside me. "They want me to wither away in shame. They don't know that a woman who has already hit the bottom of an elevator shaft has nothing left to fear from a man in a wig. They say that when you reach the bottom, there is nowhere left to go but up. They lie. When you reach the bottom, you discover there are basements, cellars, and eventually the cold, damp earth itself." After the verdict of 1963, I didn't just lose a title, I lost the right to be seen as a human being. I became a curiosity, a cautionary tale to be whispered about over gin and tonics. I had spent my life as a queen of the ballroom. Now I was a tour guide in the museum of my own disgrace, charging strangers for a glimpse of the stage where my life had been dismantled. The years following the divorce were a slow-motion car crash. In the eyes of the British establishment, I had been deleted. The invitations that once flooded my hallway like autumn leaves stopped arriving. My telephone, once a frantic instrument of social manoeuvring, became a heavy, silent object of mourning. I stayed in London, but it was a different city now. The streets I once owned felt narrow and judgmental. I could see the sideways glances in the shops of Bond Street, the very street where I had once fallen 40 feet. This fall, however, was much longer. There were no 33 stitches to mend the damage of being a pariah. My fortune, once thought to be an inexhaustible spring, began to dry up. The legal fees had been a voracious beast, devouring my Whigham inheritance. But more than that, the world I knew was changing. The 1960s were swinging for everyone else, but for me, the music had stopped. I was a relic of an era that wanted to forget the Dirty Duchess even as it obsessed over her. Desperation is the ultimate humiliator. By the late 1960s, I found myself in a position that would have made the target of 1,930 faint with horror. I needed money. I needed to maintain the facade of a duchess even though the treasury was empty. I did the unthinkable. I opened my home at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street, the site of the infamous locked drawer, to the public. I remember the first morning I stood in the hallway waiting for the first group of tourists to arrive. I wore my finest Chanel suit and my 3-strand pearl necklace, standing as stiffly as a palace guard. These people hadn't come for the architecture or the art, they had come to see the bedroom. They had come to stand in the spot where the Polaroids were taken. "This way, please," I would say, my voice a masterpiece of icy professionality. I watched them, the middle-class voyeurs, the housewives from the suburbs, the businessmen with leering eyes. They touched my silk wallpaper with greasy fingers. They whispered behind their hands when we reached my dressing room. I was selling my privacy back to the public, a shilling at a time. Every tour felt like a second trial, a repetitive, public stripping of my dignity. I would go to bed at night with my skin crawling, the smell of the common world lingering in my hallways. I would clutch my pearls until my chest hurt, whispering to the dark, "I am still the Duchess of Argyll. I am still Margaret Whigham." But the house felt like it was hollowed out, a stage set where the actors had all died. Eventually, even the tours weren't enough. The house at Upper Grosvenor Street had to be sold. It was like losing a limb. I moved into a suite at the Grosvenor House Hotel, trying to maintain a semblance of my former life. I was living in a gilded cage of credit and memory. I spent my days in the hotel lobby, a ghost in a cocktail dress. I was still beautiful, in a sharp, weathered way. But the it girl was now a yesterday's girl. I watched the new generation of celebrities, the models with their short skirts and the rock stars with their long hair, and I felt like a creature from another century. They were liberated, yet they looked at me as if I were a monster. They didn't realize that I had paved the way for their freedom with my own blood. My only constant companion was my poodle, Louis. He didn't care about the headless man. He didn't care about the Lord Wheatley verdict. He looked at me with an uncomplicated devotion that no man had ever offered. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, as the tea cooled on the tray I couldn't really afford, Louis would rest his head on my lap, his fur soft against my hand. I would sit there, stroking his head, my fingers tracing the familiar contours of my 3-strand pearls. They were my only remaining link to the woman I used to be. I had pawned almost everything else, the paintings, the silver, the smaller jewels, but the pearls stayed. They were the signature of my tragedy. I would sooner have starved than let them go. By the late 1970s and early 82nds, the hotel bills became an insurmountable wall. The management, once so deferential, began to look at me with a cold, corporate impatience. I was no longer a prestigious guest, I was a liability. The day I was asked to leave Grosvenor House was the day the last of my pride shattered. I moved to a small, cramped apartment in a less fashionable part of London. The rooms were dim, the ceilings low, a far cry from the vaulted heights of Inverary or the expanse of Manhattan. I lived among the wreckage of my empire. A few pieces of Louis XV furniture were crammed into the small living room, looking absurd and out of place. The smell of the apartment was a mix of old perfume, dog hair, and the stale scent of a life lived in the past. I became a hermit of sorts. I would venture out occasionally, always dressed as if I were going to a gala, the mink coat now thinning at the edges, the hat, the pearls. I would walk Louis in the park, my head held high, ignoring the teenagers who pointed and laughed at the crazy old lady. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, watching the London traffic. The world had moved on without me. I was no longer a headline. I was a footnote. I would look at the photos of myself from 1930, the debutante of the year, and I wouldn't recognise her. That girl had so much hope. She didn't know about the elevator shaft. She didn't know about the Byronic devil. She didn't know that she would end her days in a room that smelled of loneliness. The Dirty Duchess was a ghost now. The world had moved on to newer, shinier scandals. But the emptiness in my chest was the same one I had felt in 1933. I had sought love and found a transaction. I had sought status and found a pillory. I would take off my 3-strand pearl necklace at night and lay it on the bedside table. In the moonlight, the pearls still glowed with that same indifferent luster. They were the only things that hadn't aged. They were the only things that hadn't betrayed me. "We're all that's left, Louis," I would whisper to the sleeping dog. "Just me, you, and the pearls. And maybe, in the end, that's all I ever really had." Gravity is a persistent creditor. It always comes back to collect the debt. They say life is a circle, and mine was closed by a fall as cold and sudden as the one that began my undoing. But do not pity me. As I lay on the linoleum floor of a nursing home, 1,000 miles from the ballrooms of my youth, I realised that I had outlived the men who tried to break me and the judges who tried to shame me. I was Margaret, always Margaret, and even in the end, the pearls stayed on. The 1990s did not suit me. The world had become loud, plastic, and dreadfully informal. I spent my final years in a nursing home in Pimlico, a place where the walls were painted the colour of institutional oatmeal and the air smelled of floor wax and faded dreams. I was a difficult patient, or so they said. They didn't understand that a duchess does not simply cooperate. I insisted on being dressed every morning as if I were expecting a visit from the Queen Mother. My hair was coiffed, my makeup applied with trembling fingers, and my 3-strand pearl necklace was fastened securely around my neck. The nurses, young women who knew nothing of the 1930s, looked at me with a mixture of amusement and pity. "Why bother with the jewellery, Margaret?" one asked as she adjusted my pillows. "Because, my dear," I replied, my voice a rasp of its former glory. "Without the jewellery, one is simply a body. With it, one is an event." I spent my days in a high-backed chair by the window, watching the London rain. My memory became a fragmented kaleidoscope. I would see David Niven's grin in the steam of my tea. I would hear the roar of Glen Kidston's engine in the passing traffic. I would feel the icy breath of Inverare in every draft that slipped through the window pane. I was living in a gallery of ghosts, and I was the only one left to tell their stories. It happened on a Tuesday in 1993. I was 85 years old, but in my mind, I was still the girl who could command a room with a glance. I went to the bathroom, refusing the help of the orderlies. I would have sooner died than have a stranger assist me with my most private functions. The floor was wet. A single, treacherous bead of water. I felt my foot slip. It was a sensation I knew in my marrow. The world tipped. For a fraction of a second, I wasn't in a nursing home in Pimlico. I was back in 1943, stepping into the void on Bond Street. The same rush of air, the same sickening realization that the earth had abandoned me. I fell. There were no elevator cables to catch me this time. There was no 40-foot drop, just the hard, unforgiving reality of the bathroom floor. My neck struck the edge of the porcelain with a sharp, dry snap, the sound of a dry twig breaking in the highlands. I lay there, my face pressed against the cold tiles. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't move my arms. The pain was distant, a white noise at the edge of my consciousness. I looked at the floor and saw a few stray pearls that had scattered when the necklace broke under the impact. They rolled across the linoleum, gleaming like tiny, discarded planets. Mia mai thai, I whispered, the words barely a breath. How ironic. I had survived the great fall of my youth only to be finished by a slip in a bathroom. But as the darkness began to pool at the edges of my vision, I felt a strange sense of peace. The debt was paid. The gravity had finally won. I had left instructions. I was not to be buried in the cold, damp earth of the Campbell estate, among the hypocrites who had used me and discarded me. I refused to spend eternity in the shadow of Inverare. Instead, I chose to return to the only man who had ever truly tried to offer me a home, despite our failures. I was buried in Putney Vale Cemetery, next to my first husband, Charles Sweeney. The funeral was a quiet affair. The 88 men were mostly gone, lost to time and war. The society that had branded me the Dirty Duchess had moved on to newer scandals, more graphic photographs, and louder infidelities. But as they lowered my casket into the earth, I felt a sense of triumph. I was no longer the Duchess of Argyll. I was Margaret Whigham Sweeney, the girl who had started it all. As I lie here in the silence, beneath the roots of the London trees, I have a final message for the world that judged me. You called me dirty. You called me lewd. You used your courts and your newspapers to build a pyre for my reputation. But why? Because I refused to hide? Because I dared to document the desires you all felt but were too cowardly to admit? You, the aristocracy, with your traditional values and your sanctity of marriage, I saw your secrets. I saw the dukes who were drunks, the lords who were gamblers, and the ladies who conducted their affairs in the shadows of garden sheds and hunting lodges. Your only virtue was your discretion. Mine was my honesty. You were obsessed with me. You still are. Every time a woman dares to be unapologetic, every time a scandal breaks the surface of your polished society, you see the ghost of my 3-strand pearl necklace. I am the itch you cannot scratch. I am the mirror you are afraid to look into. I lived. I truly, vibrantly lived. I felt the wind on the Isle of Wight, the speed of Glen's planes, the heat of 1,000 nights, and even the cold sting of the elevator shaft. I took the perfection you expected of me, and I shattered it, because a life without cracks is not a life at all. It is a tomb. You can keep your titles and your crumbling castles. I have my story, and as long as there is a woman who refuses to apologize for her hunger, I will never truly be dead. I am Margaret, and I am still wearing my pearls.